According to the World Economic Forum, there is $5 trillion of global corruption being siphoned off our global economic system. That's about 5% of total global production. I started to think, what does the company want? Do they want aggressive commercial forecasts that they set, or do they want me to abide by global anti-bribery laws? I had to sacrifice integrity to succeed, and took ethics and integrity into my own hands, which starts the corruption chapter of this story.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's LinkedIn Live. Today, we have a big topic. It's getting harder and harder for companies to know which way to go when it comes to doing the right thing. We have a lot of rules and expectations around ethics that don't line up globally anymore. At least that's what I'm hearing from my clients and seeing out in the world. And that's putting a lot of pressure on our leaders, although we don't talk about it very much. So today we're chatting with my friend and colleague, Richard Bistrong, who's the co-author with Anna Romberg of a new HBR article titled How to Approach Business Ethics as the Global Consensus Breaks Down. So we'll be talking about what all this means in practice, how to stick to your values, how to have really tough conversations, and to lead through all the uncertainty that we have today. So thought-provoking, and I know it will be useful for all those of us who are facing it. And I just want to say a few words about Richard before I ask him to introduce himself. He's not just an expert on anti-bribery and compliance, he's really lived it. He's the CEO of Frontline Anti-Bribery, and he brings a really rare perspective from the true front lines of global sales and enforcement, and his insights have shaped ethics programs at places like Microsoft, Kraft Heinz, Airbus, and many, many more. And he's also helped law enforcement agencies worldwide really understand the realities of the pressure, performance, and moral compromise that we have in today's business environment. So I could not be happier to introduce Richard. So welcome, Richard. I'm really eager to dive into all of this and the leadership framework that your article outlines. But first, it would be great if you could just share a little bit about your background with people who don't know you the way that I do.
Sure. Well, Karen, I could not be happier to be joining you on this LinkedIn Live, and thanks to everyone who's joining us. Karen, I like to look at my career in three chapters. One is commerce, two is corruption, and three is compliance. So the first chapter in commerce was 20 years as a sales vice president working for a multinational that is probably not too different than a lot of the companies that are joining us today and a lot of the leaders that are joining us today. It was a great company, a wonderful heritage, publicly listed, had a strong balance sheet, and global operations. And I spent the first half of my career as the vice president of U.S. sales. This company manufactured armored vehicles and armored vests, for example. So it's exciting to work for a company that saves people's lives. And in the second half of that career, I focused on international sales as the VP of international sales, a much different environment. Okay? I mean, according to the World Economic Forum, there is $5 trillion of global corruption being siphoned off our global economic system. That's about 5% of total global production.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt just to underline that $5 trillion.
$5 trillion.
Okay.
And that's up. And traveling around the world 250 days a year for the better part of a decade, understanding that bribery was and still is illegal. There are a number of laws, both here in the US, in the UK, and France, that make all forms of bribery to keep business, to win business, either on your own or through someone else, it's illegal. I understood that. But traveling around in these parts of the world, some that were quite high in corruption risk, due to no one's fault but my own, so there's no ethical spinning here, I started to think, what does the company want? Do they want aggressive commercial forecasts that they set,
Mm-hmm.
or do they want me to abide by global anti-bribery laws? And due to no one's fault but my own, I didn't think I could deliver both, right? That I had to sacrifice
Sure.
integrity to succeed, and took ethics and integrity into my own hands, which starts the corruption chapter of this story. And I engaged in a number of bribery conspiracies to influence the decision making of public officials, right? And that's against the law. It's also against our values. It's not ethical. And some of these conspiracies, Karen, took place right here in New York, where I'm joining you today, at the United Nations. Some of them took place in the Netherlands. So sometimes we think there are places there are high risk, but we should never think there's a place in the world where there's no risk when it comes to ethical conduct, compliance, and bribery. But the investigators eventually caught up with me, and I got swept up into an investigation into corruption in the United Nations in 2007. So I'm dating myself a little bit. I got a call from the Justice Department and authorities in the United Kingdom that I was the target of a criminal investigation. And not to burn up too much of our introductory time, I immediately faced justice. I didn't want to delay it. I knew that if I wanted to change the course of my life, which brought us together, that I would have to face the consequences of these decisions. So I entered into cooperation agreements in the United States and the United Kingdom, and I was ultimately sentenced to 14 months in prison, returning home in December of 2013.
Okay.
Which brings us to today's world of compliance and this article about how to approach business ethics as global consensus breaks down. And Karen, what I try to share is this perspective of mixed signals. Speaking as former commercial Richard and current compliance Richard, what are the messages that we're sending to the workforce? I was not at all unique in feeling this tension between the pressure to succeed and the pressure to comply with the law. And I thought, again, due to no one's fault but my own, that I was on my own to untangle those, what I thought of as corporate conflicts. So for today's discussion, we'll fast forward this compliance journey into what the world looks like now, which was a lot more complicated than when I started sharing my story 10 years ago.
Yeah. So you've been, I guess, the past decade or so working with primarily these large global organizations on how to deal with these types of issues. And it seems to me that we are now in a place where, I don't know if the issues are just more prominent, but that there is more of a breakdown of sort of the global consensus on ethics. For example, the U.S. just recently issued a pause on anti-bribery enforcement, whatever that means, whereas the EU is preparing to issue a directive on anti-corruption to have even more rigorous standards, so sort of two ends of that continuum. So I guess I'd like to start with, was there a global consensus or just a Western one as a place to start? And I have that as a question, not an answer, framed as a question. Were global corporations, really in consensus about this?
So we can divide that into a north-south question or an east-west question. And in the best of times, there's never like true consensus. But Karen, I think globally, we were heading in the right direction in this anti-corruption journey, that there was seemingly a movement from organizations like the OECD and the B20, G20, World Economic Forum. Everyone was heading in the direction of, we need to start to break apart that $5 trillion, right, and address the supply side and the demand side. So I think there was meaningful cooperation in the right direction when it came to global anti-bribery efforts. Not perfect, but certainly not confusing either.
Okay. I'd say it sounds like that's particularly true for the organizations that we're familiar with, right? The audience that is likely going to be tuning into this and watching it afterwards. So given all of that, how should leaders balance these sort of conflicting ethical considerations, particularly between regions now, without compromising their core values?
So as a friend of mine, Scott Sullivan, who's got decades of ethics and compliance experience, I mean, leaders need to appreciate that they cast a very long shadow when it comes to setting ethical expectations. For the leaders and the CEOs that are joining us today, I think we should maybe level set that just first, when they're setting ethical expectations, when they're talking about responsible business conduct, it sounds so much louder to the workforce, to the former commercial Richards out there, because it sounds like here at our organization, doing what's right isn't dependent on a law or a regulation. It's how we conduct business. It's an integral part of our values. Whereas for a lot of organizations where the only function that's talking about doing what's right, or maybe your legal and compliance teams, it sounds like, well, here in our organization, doing what's right is a support function, where when it's coming out of the voice of our leaders here today, it sounds like doing what's right is part of our corporate narrative, not just part of our compliance narrative. So I think for leaders, let's acknowledge the tension that exists out there, but also let's appreciate the power of their voice when it comes to just acknowledging it.
Yeah. And maybe to compare that to something that we all think about every day in our organizations now, it's security, right? We used to think about security, back in the day as the security officer, right? Or the enforcers in the organization. And really security in today's environment has to be everybody, right? And we have too many examples of people who've done something on their laptops and then took down an organization. And it's the same sort of thing around ethics, right? It's not the ethics officers, if you're lucky enough to have one, job to make sure that everyone is ethical. It is everyone's job. And as you say, it begins at the top of the house about making sure people understand that.
One of my favorite client examples of this is an organization that launched a really wonderful, almost like Netflix style compliance set of modules. And you know what? I'm going to roll back. It wasn't called compliance. It was called #responsibility starts with me.
Great. Yeah.
And it was a wonderful set of taking people through a number of different issues. What can drive us in the wrong direction? What are the biases and ethical blind spots that we need to think about, right? So they don't catch us when it's too late. So yeah, I think that the thinking about what does drive ethical conduct and appreciating that there are ethical blind spots and acknowledging them and addressing them, that brings us a long way to going in the right direction.
Yeah. Definitely the first step in all of that. I was just casting, sort of back in my life about times when I had bumped into this. And I did work for a large company at one point that had I don't know how to say this. It had a practice that I felt was outside our stated culture. And the practice was overseas. And so in some ways it was sort of boxed. And I was not in a role at that time. It was very early in my career where I felt like I could speak up about it. And it was just not right. And when I did talk with somebody about it, it was like, oh, that's the way it's done here. Sort of move along. And I know I didn't know what to do about it then, right? Still, but you emphasize in your article sort of this importance of embracing friction, which is what this was about. And what are some signs that an organization might be avoiding healthy friction, and how can leaders turn that around?
Yeah, I think, if an organization doesn't have friction, which simply put are like, those are the things that people might think are slowing them down or getting in the way of success. And they might be expressing it to their supervisor or to the ethics and compliance team, like, oh my gosh, this process is fatiguing me, right? Like it's just causing me so much time and I'm not able to focus on what my job is, right? That's friction, or an example of friction. The absence of that type of conversation can mean one of two things. It can mean that there are mechanisms and that there are structures that help drive healthy, constructive friction and disagreement, or it could mean that there's an overpowering narrative, like you described, that says, this is how we're getting this done, and I really don't want to hear anything about it, right? So I think part of, addressing friction, again, are leaders to acknowledge, look, there are going to be bottlenecks, there are going to be issues. And I know we're both a fan of Amy Edmondson and her work.
Yes.
And one of the lovely things that she shares is, don't take a shortcut, right? Don't have an exception mentality, like, oh, just this time I'm going to do it. Because as she well shares, if someone takes a shortcut instead of having friction with being frustrated at a certain process, the person that takes that shortcut, it might benefit them because they're getting their job done faster, but it puts the entire enterprise at risk. Right. So I think leaders and, everybody joining us today can have an appreciation that, look, there's only one way we get better and have better processes. And that's if you share the bottlenecks, if you share what's frustrating you and getting in between success and your work, like, let us know. We're here to try to make things easier. And again, one of my favorite client sayings here is the CEO. It was a construction company, and they were in the middle of a very difficult market. And he said two things that really inspired me. One was, tell me what I can do to support you, right? I think they call that servant leadership. I'm not here to tell you what you need to do for me. I'm here to say, how can I better help you? And then he said, and I just, as a reminder, because we're in a tough market circumstance, the only problem that I can't help you with or my team can't help you with is the one that you're keeping to your own or to yourself. So again, let's try to have healthy constructs and structures that will help surface these issues and not encourage people to bury them.
Yeah. Oh, I love that story, Richard. It's about making things conscious, I guess, in the organization. Yeah. And there will be bottlenecks where you make a decision to sort of break through rather than to do something that might take more time. But you need to be conscious about that. I actually worked, again, early in my career with a CFO who said, bring me your problems when they're small. He said, nobody should wake up every morning with this big problem in the pit of their stomach that they don't know what they're going to do with. Just bring them to me. But if you bring them to me when they're small, we can easily do something about them or decide not to, but you don't have to carry it by yourself. And it's better for you, it's better for the organization, it's better for everybody. And so surfacing, but the culture has to be there and the values have to be there for that surfacing to occur, because it's a risk, right? To say, I have a problem in many organizations. So how can leaders distinguish between sort of the values that are really lived across an organization, like bring me your problems when they're small, and those that only exist on paper or, on the wall in a frame?
Yeah, these are so important, Karen, because these are leadership signals, right? Like leaders don't control the whole organization, but they can have such an impact. And just as an aside, as I often share, problems age like milk, not wine. They do not get better over time. And I think that's a great signal to say the smaller the problem, the easier it is to course correct it. We may have to go backwards and maybe reverse a transaction, but when it's small, we can deal with it. And I think this brings up two thoughts that are in the article. Is we don't want values, and give me a corporate website, I'll show you aspirational values. They're all there. We do great things. Integrity is critical. Like I call them wall posters, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what they are. Unless you operationalize them. And I think this is a really good time to pressure test your values. And you can survey to find out what people think of them, or you can have focus groups, a number of things that Anna and I talk about in the article. But here's like a great way to pressure test a value. Would our values guide us if there was no external regulation or internal policy covering a set of circumstance? That's one great pressure test question is, do we have ambiguous values that could be misinterpreted in different countries and regions? Because this is not a one-size-fits-all problem or solution. And Karen, I think the way this happens, it was a wonderful article I read in MIT Sloan called Building Culture from the Middle Out. So our leaders here today are responsible for the big C culture, right? For these aspirational messages, doing what's right. But what does that mean to your team in South America? What does that mean to your team in the Middle East? And what the article talks about is that's your little C culture. Those are the people that can take those values and make sure that they make sense in the context of the environment in Argentina or the environment in Dubai, for example. The challenges are different. So I think a lot of organizations say we have this great big C culture, but what does that look like on the ground? That's the little C. And I think that sometimes is a link that's missing. And we have seen a number of great companies have significant problems because their culture got frozen in the middle of the organization. And there's a survey we can put a link to that talks about how leaders think their organization is far more ethical than mid-level managers think of them. So there is this huge leadership gap and leadership divide when it comes to the C-suite and middle-level managers, just on their perception of how well our company is executing on its values.
Yeah. Yes, we will put that link in. Thank you for bringing that up. It's, it's no one here is ill-intended, right? In the kind of example that you're giving, which I think is what exists in most organizations. Everybody's trying to do the right thing. It's just not always clear what that is when there's this disconnect between, as you say, the big C culture and the little C culture. I'm not sure how to do this on the camera, CNC. But at the end of the day, the culture is the behaviors that we both incent in the organization, but primarily it's the behaviors that we allow and disallow, right? And if you as a leader are disconnected from what the behaviors are, there's then you don't know what you're allowing or disallowing in the organization.
That's a great point. And it's also a good time, and it was our third recommendation, is it's a good time to do a health check on your culture, because a lot of organizations, a lot of leaders here have probably set their rewards and their goals and objectives last year, in 2024, as this is what 2025 is going to look like. 2025 is a lot different in Q1 than it was in Q4 of 2024. So maybe this is also a good time for leaders to make sure that those goals still align with values and that they haven't run afoul of reality.
Yeah, this is definitely a time when people are under, I think the last several years it's been true, but certainly now under a lot more pressure. And it's when we're under pressure, it's easy to do the things that we know are right when things are easy. And when you're facing hard wins in front of you, sometimes you want to tack, right or left. And that seems to be when we lose our way. You also talk a little bit in the article about something called an exception culture, which I think gets to the heart of how we align ethics with performance metrics, which is sort of key to success, I think, in today's organizations. Could you talk a bit about that?
I'd be happy to. And we have seen this, and I've, read through plea agreements and enforcement documents where organizations did have a good compliance platform, but they were overruled by the business with we need to do it just this time.
Just this time.
Okay. And once you do it once, it's a lot easier to argue, well, look, we did this in the past. We were successful. No one had any issues with it. It didn't land us on the front page of a newspaper. And we're facing the same circumstances again. So I think we need to take the same course of action. So, again, once this sort of shortcut mentality starts to take hold, it can impact all of our decisions, whether it's an anti-bribery decision, a data privacy decision, or just, facing an ethical dilemma. We might think, look, if I need to circumvent things to get things done, that's tolerated around here. And that yet is another one of our mixed signals that when leaders tolerate this sort of exception mentality, it's a big, I think Edward Schein called this, like, this is how things get done around here.
Yeah, and for me, there's nothing worse than sending mixed signals to your organization. And to go back to your big C, little c culture, that almost drives a breakdown, because then people, I think about our values, our priorities as the things that sort of set the bar for the 10,000 things that the people in your organization are doing every day. And once those things are unclear, those 10,000 things that everybody is doing every day go in so many different directions that things break down. And that's just a really great example that you've given. Thank you on how that happens. So just this once. So what does that mean for me and my job when I see that happening? Yeah. And it's the sort of thing that comes up when I'm coaching somebody. Well, so-and-so is doing it and nothing happened to them. Right. And exactly. So how can you tell me that I shouldn't be doing it?
Yeah. This brings to mind, I know we're both also fans of Ron Carucci, who did this wonderful longitudinal study that had a lot of different conclusions, but one of them is when people are talking, when there's strong collaboration, cooperation, and communication, or better said, or just as well said, constructive friction between different departments and different functions, that organizations are 6 times more likely to engage in truth-telling behaviors. So think about the power of the more we're talking to each other, and there's so much research on this, including Amy Edmondson, the more we're talking to each other when there's not an issue and we get to know each other and we know that we're available, we're always here to help, the more likelihood that we will reach out to one another if we do face an ethical dilemma. So the time to build relationships is not in the middle of a crisis. It's let's get to know each other before the crisis so we know who we're calling. We know we're not going to be judged, that we're in a speak out and listen up environment, as Megan Ratz describes in her book. So I love all the research that's out there on this. It's just a matter of executing on it.
Yeah. Well, it's building trust, right? And that's one of those things that people might say is sort of fuzzy in an organization, but there is research here by multiple people that supports when we have relationships, when we build trust, people will have honest conversations. And when they do, these problems that we were talking about earlier get surfaced. And it's just, as you say, a mountain of research there. So Richard, we're coming to the end of our time, and we've talked about a few things that CEOs can do, that leaders can do in an organization. I don't know if you want to summarize those, or if you have what can a CEO do sort of in this environment to do the right thing. I'll just say that.
Yeah. So thank you, Karen. Thank you for sharing your experience and client work on this very stubborn topic as well. I think for our leaders here today, let's remember that long ethical shadow that you cast when it comes to people looking for signals. And that, again, it goes back to the power of your voice. People are stressed, they're uncertain, they're they're anxious about their futures. Just by acknowledging that tension, you're going a long way for people to feel comfortable to reach out and say, that goal set last year doesn't make sense when we're in this sanction and tariff environment. I don't know how I'm going to get there. I need help. So these difficult discussions for our leaders today, they will not happen on their own. But if you're intentional about it, I think your organizations will follow course.
Wow, what a powerful message. And I thank you again, Richard, for sharing your time and your expertise with us. So again, we've been speaking today with Richard Bistrong, who's the CEO of Frontline Anti-Bribery. He's the author of a new article on HBR that really caught my attention because it's so relevant for today, how to approach business ethics as global consensus breaks down. Thank you again, Richard, for joining us today, and wishing you all the best.
Thank you, Karen, and good luck to our leaders and everyone who's joined us today. Thank you.